They called him a monster. She called him her only chance at survival. On the frozen peaks of Blackstone Ridge, one name had silenced entire posses, scattered armed outlaws, and driven seasoned mountain men back down the trail with nothing but their fear intact. Gideon Voss. 7 feet of fury and solitude, a man who had chosen the wilderness over humanity, and enforced that choice with his fists. But when the worst blizzard in a decade buried the mountain passes and left Mabel Hartwell with nowhere left to run, she stumbled through the snow toward the one place every living soul had been warned to avoid. And she knocked on the door anyway. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, keep watching. Like this video, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and follow the channel so you never miss what comes next. The storm came without much warning, the way the worst ones always did. There had been signs, if a person knew what to look for. The way the horses at Calloway's livery had been restless since morning, stamping and tossing their heads for no reason anyone could name. The way the light had gone flat and yellow by midday, even though there wasn't a cloud visible from the main road. Old Decker, who ran the feed store on the east end of Harlan's Crossing, had told anyone who'd listened that the air tasted wrong, like iron and cold river water mixed together. Nobody paid him much attention. Old Decker said a lot of things. By 3 in the afternoon, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, and by 4, the snow was coming down sideways. Mabel Hartwell had been 12 miles out of town when it started. She knew it immediately for what it was, not just a winter squall you could push through with your coat collar up and your eyes narrowed, but the kind of storm that could bury a wagon to its axles in 40 minutes and freeze a horse solid overnight if you were unlucky about where you stopped. She'd grown up hearing her father describe storms like this. He'd always called them killers wearing white. He had not been wrong. She pulled the mule to a halt at the edge of the tree line and tried to get her bearings. The problem was she didn't entirely have bearings to get. She'd taken the Ridgeback Trail out of Harlan's Crossing because the lower road, the sensible road, the road everyone used, had been washed out 3 days earlier when Clearwater Creek jumped its banks. Someone at the general store had told her the Ridgeback Trail connected back to the main pass about 8 miles in. That had been the extent of the directions she'd received, and she was beginning to suspect the person who'd given them had never actually walked that particular stretch of ground. She was also, in the interest of being honest with herself, lost. The trail markers, wooden posts with painted notches, the kind the county surveyor had put in 2 summers back, had become invisible under the snow accumulation. Everything looked the same now. White and gray and more white. The pine trees looming dark on both sides, the wind coming through them in long, moaning gusts that made the mule pin its ears back and lean into her. "I know," she told it. "I don't like it either." Her name was Mabel Hartwell. She was 31 years old, and she had been riding out to the Keswick homestead to deliver medicine, laudanum, and willowbark compound to a family whose youngest child had come down with a fever that wasn't breaking. She'd volunteered to go because the Kesslers who normally ran supply runs were down with influenza themselves, and nobody else at the post had stepped forward, and she had never quite learned how to watch a problem sit there unsolved if there was something she could do about it. She was also, as the women at the church auxiliary had taken to remarking when they thought she couldn't hear, a woman of considerable size. Heavy through the hips and shoulders, wide-faced, with thick hands that had never been what anyone would call delicate. She had stopped caring about those remarks around the age of 22, or at least she had stopped letting them land the way they used to. She was strong. She could work a full day and still have something left at the end of it. She could lift things most of the men at the post would hesitate over. If people wanted to look at her and see something lesser, that was a failure of their imagination, not of her body. What she was not was a mountain survival expert, and the mountain right now did not appear to care about any of her other qualities. She made a decision because standing still in a whiteout was the one thing you absolutely could not do. She turned the mule uphill toward the ridgeline, reasoning that higher ground might give her a sightline once the snow thinned even briefly. It was not a perfect plan. It might not even have been a good plan, but it was the one she had, and she took it. For the next hour, she climbed. The mule's name was Perseverance, which Mabel had always found either funny or appropriate depending on the day. Today, it was appropriate. The animal kept moving even when the drifts came up past its knees, even when the wind hit them broadside hard enough to make Mabel grab the saddle horn with both hands and hang on. She talked to it continuously, because she'd read once that animals took comfort from a calm human voice, and because she needed something to focus on besides how cold her feet had become inside her boots. "Left side looks a little more sheltered," she said, mostly to herself. "See those big spruce? Wind comes in from the northeast up here, I think, so the east face of that ridge should give us something." Perseverance did not respond to this analysis, but did not object to the direction either. They found a narrow cut in the rock face about 20 minutes later, a natural break in the ridge that the snow had piled up against but not filled. Mabel climbed down, carefully, because the ground was treacherous and she had no interest in a broken ankle, and led the mule in beside her. For a few minutes she just stood there catching her breath, her back to the stone, watching the snow come down. She had maybe 2 hours of light left, less with the cloud cover. She had a bedroll strapped to the saddle, a half-day's worth of dried food in her pack, and a flint kit. What she did not have was a tent, because she'd planned to be back in town by dark. She could survive the night in the cut if she had to. She thought. Probably. If the temperature didn't drop much further, it dropped further. By the time the last gray light was fading out of the sky, Mabel could no longer feel her toes properly, and the mule had started shivering, which was a bad sign. She'd managed to get a small fire going, a genuine accomplishment in that wind, one she was quietly proud of. But it was doing more for her morale than for her actual body temperature. She was eating a piece of dried venison she'd found at the bottom of her pack and thinking very seriously about her options when she saw the light. It was above her and to the northeast, just a flicker at first, something she thought her cold-numbed brain had invented. Then it steadied, orange-yellow, the unmistakable color of firelight through a window. A cabin. She stared at it for a long time. She knew where she was now, roughly. She'd climbed far enough up the Blackstone Ridge that she was inside territory every person in Harlan's Crossing knew to avoid. The high country. Voss country. Gideon Voss. She'd heard the stories, everyone had. The man who'd broken 3 of Calloway's best trackers when they'd tried to survey his land without permission. Broken meaning put in the hospital, not just turned away. The man who'd driven a party of 8 armed men back down the mountain by appearing out of the tree line at midnight, alone, and making clear without many words that leaving was the correct choice. The man who'd lived up here by himself for God knew how many years, who came down into town maybe twice a year, and whose presence cleared a room the way a rattlesnake clears a porch. 7 feet tall, or near enough that the difference didn't matter. Hands like shovels. A face that had taken enough weather and violence that it had stopped looking entirely human to the people who described it. A monster, most of them said. A beast that happened to walk upright. Mabel sat in the dark and the cold and weighed this against the feeling she was losing in her extremities, and she reached a conclusion. She put out the small fire, packed her flint kit, and started climbing toward the light. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure exactly what she'd expected. Something crude, maybe. 4 walls and a roof held together by hostility and spite. What she found instead was a structure that had been built with serious intent. Thick-cut logs, notched and fitted properly, the chinking between them tight and well-maintained. A real roof, steep pitch to shed snow, with what looked like a hand-hewn ridge beam. A separate structure nearby that was probably a smokehouse or a storage shed. Stacked firewood along the south wall, a cord at least, maybe more under the snow. Someone had put genuine work into this place. Someone had intended to stay. She tied Perseverance to a post near the wood stack. There was some shelter from the overhang, and the mule pressed gratefully into the lee side of the cabin wall, and she walked to the door. She could hear movement inside. Something heavy shifting, the creak of weight on a plank floor. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again, harder. "Hello? I'm lost. The storm caught me on the Ridgeback Trail. I need shelter for the night." Nothing for a long moment. Then a voice came through the door, low and rough and carrying the particular flatness of someone who had spent a lot of time without anyone to talk to. "No." Just that. One word. Mabel looked at her hands. She couldn't entirely feel her fingers anymore. She looked back at the door. "Sir, I understand if you don't want company. I'm not asking to be welcomed. I'm asking not to die on your doorstep." Another silence, longer this time. Go back down the mountain. I cannot go back down the mountain. I can't see the trail. My mule is half frozen, and I've lost feeling in my feet. If I try to go back down the mountain, I will die somewhere between here and the tree line, and you'll find me in the spring thaw. She paused. I'd rather not put you through that. The silence stretched long enough that she started to think he'd simply decided to wait her out. Then she heard the bar being lifted on the other side of the door, a heavy sound, solid wood against solid wood, and the door opened. The first thing that hit her was the heat rolling out into the cold air like something physical. The second thing was the smell of the cabin, pine smoke and cured meat, and something underneath that was just the smell of a place where one person had lived alone for a long time, not unpleasant exactly, but dense and particular, a smell that had nowhere to go. The third thing was Gideon Voss. The stories, she understood immediately, had not been exaggerating about the size. He filled the door frame, not figuratively, not as an expression, but literally. His shoulders nearly touched both sides, and he had to duck his head to stand in the opening. He was wearing a heavy wool shirt with the sleeves pushed up despite the cold air, and his forearms were the size of most men's thighs. His hair was dark and long and unkempt in a way that suggested he cut it when it started to bother him, and not before. His beard was the same, heavy, full, growing without particular design. He was somewhere in his late 30s, she thought, though the face was hard to read under all that hair and weather damage. His eyes were the most startling part. Dark, set deep, and currently fixed on her with an expression that was not welcoming but was, she noticed, not entirely closed either. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a problem they haven't classified yet. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. His eyes went over her the way you'd assess a situation. Not rudely, not in the way men at the saloon sometimes looked at women, but evaluatively, cataloging details, the snow on her coat, the color of her hands, the way she was holding her weight. You're frozen through, he said. It wasn't sympathy, it was diagnosis. Getting there, she agreed. He stepped back from the doorframe, not welcoming exactly, more like clearing an obstacle. Get inside. She did. Ishan. The interior of the cabin was one large room with a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall. A table, rough-hewn but solid. 2 chairs, one of which was clearly used, and one of which looked like it might have been made and then forgotten about. A sleeping area in the far corner with what appeared to be a substantial pile of hides and blankets. Shelves along one wall with supplies organized in a way that was functional but not careful. Things put where they'd been put and not moved again. A large iron pot was hanging over the fire. Whatever was in it smelled like venison stew. Mabel stood near the door and started working on the buttons of her coat, which was a slow process because her fingers weren't doing what she asked of them. She managed it eventually. Gideon had moved to the fireplace and was standing with his back to her, not doing anything in particular. She got the sense he wasn't sure what to do with a person in his space. Like the presence of another human being required calculations he hadn't had to run in a long time. Your mule, he said, still not turning around. I tied her near the wood stack. There's some shelter from the overhang. Not enough. He turned and picked up a heavy coat from a hook near the door. Larger than anything Mabel had ever seen on a person, the coat of someone built outside normal proportions, and pulled it on. I'll put her in the shelter. He went out before she could respond. Mabel stood in the warmth and listened to the wind and slowly, carefully, began to feel her feet again, which was an unpleasant process involving a particular kind of deep ache that she'd always found oddly reassuring. Pain meant circulation. Circulation meant no frostbite. She looked around the cabin while she waited. The organization of the shelves told her things. The supplies were substantial. Clearly a man who planned ahead and understood how long a hard winter could run. Dried meat, salt, dried beans, some root vegetables she couldn't identify from across the room. Tools hung on pegs near the door, a hatchet, a large hunting knife, what looked like a hand-forged awl, some equipment she recognized as trapping gear. Everything used, nothing decorative. There was one thing she hadn't expected. On the shelf nearest the window, sitting slightly apart from the practical items, was a stack of books. 6 or 7 of them, maybe more. She couldn't read the titles from here, but the spines were worn and the pages looked handled. Not display books, reading books. She filed that away. Gideon came back and, trailing cold air and snow, pulled the door shut behind him and shed the big coat back onto its hook with the economical motion of a man who did physical things without thinking about them. "She's in the lean-to," he said. "Got some hay." "Thank you," he grunted. Went to the fire and checked the pot without looking at her. "You eat?" "I had some dried venison a few hours ago." He found a second bowl on the shelf. Not the one he used, a slightly smaller one, also plain clay, and ladled stew into it without ceremony. He put it on the table and sat in his chair. She sat in the other one. They ate in silence for a while. The stew was good. Better than she'd expected, seasoned with something she couldn't identify. The meat properly cooked. Not the rough survival food of a man who didn't care what things tasted like. He'd put effort into this. "You came up the ridgeback," he said eventually. It wasn't a question. "Lower road washed out." "Lower road's been out since Thursday. People in town know to take the Miller Pass." "Nobody told me about Miller Pass." He looked at her then, direct and measuring. "What were you doing on the mountain?" "Taking medicine to the Keswick homestead. They've got a sick child." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. "Keswicks are the other side of the ridge, 8 miles east." "I know. I was trying to get there before the storm." "Storm was visible by noon." "I was already 12 miles out by noon." She met his eyes. "I made a judgment call that turned out to be wrong. I'm aware of that. I'm here instead of dead, so I'll call it a partial success." He looked at her for another moment, then he went back to his stew. "You'll sleep by the fire," he said. "There's extra hides. Storm should break by morning, maybe midday. Then you go." "Understood. And I want no noise after dark. I sleep light. I'm a quiet person." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that general vicinity, skeptical, brief. "You talked at my door for 3 minutes straight. That was survival talking. I'm normally quite restrained." He looked at her again. Something passed through his expression that she couldn't read, gone too fast to catch. He stood and took his bowl to the basin, and that was apparently the end of the conversation. She woke once in the night when the wind hit the cabin like a physical thing, a concussive gust that made the walls shudder and the fire flare sideways. She was warm enough. Gideon had put 3 heavy hides near the hearth without comment before turning in, a pile that was frankly more bedding than she'd had in some time. But the sound of the storm was something else. It wasn't weather you heard, it was weather you felt in your sternum. She lay there for a while and listened to it and thought about the Keswick child and hoped the fever had broken on its own. In the morning, the storm was still running. Not as violent as the night, but steady and relentless, the kind of snow that comes down without particular fury, but simply doesn't stop. Visibility from the cabin's single window was maybe 30 feet before the white swallowed everything. Gideon was already up when she came back to full wakefulness. She could smell coffee, which she hadn't expected, and hear the sound of him moving outside. She got herself organized, folded the hides neatly, and set them aside, and was standing at the window with a cup of the coffee he'd left on the hearth, taking it without asking, which she'd decided was probably fine given the circumstances. When he came back in, he looked at the folded hides. He looked at the cup in her hand. He said nothing about either. "Storm's not breaking," he said instead. "I can see that. Might be 2 days." She let that settle. "All right." He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her with that same evaluative expression she'd seen the night before. She'd had some time to think about what it meant, that look. It wasn't the look of a man deciding whether to throw someone out. It was the look of a man trying to solve a problem he hadn't anticipated, the problem of another person. "You'll stay out of my way," he said. "I can do that." She paused. "Though I'll warn you, I'm not well designed for sitting still." "What does that mean?" "It means if I see something that needs doing, I'm going to have a hard time not doing it. It's a personal failing." She took a sip of the coffee. "But I'll try." He looked at the cup in her hand again. Then he turned and went to the fire and poured his own cup, and that was, apparently, his response. She lasted about 4 hours. She'd tried. She'd sat by the fire. She'd watched the snow through the window. She'd reviewed everything she knew about the Keswick family and how long a child that age could carry a fever without serious intervention, and decided that if the storm broke tomorrow, she could still make it there in time if she moved quickly. But there was a problem that kept catching her eye: the trapping equipment near the door. Gideon had a collection of snare wire and spring traps that had clearly not been tended in some time. Several of the spring mechanisms were showing the early signs of rust in their joints, the kind of thing that would make them unreliable at exactly the wrong moment. It wasn't a disaster yet, but it was heading that way. She looked at the traps. She looked at Gideon, who was at the table doing something with a piece of leather, repair work of some kind, careful and focused. She looked at the tools on the wall. There was an oil tin and a collection of rags near the hatchet. Exactly what you'd need. "Would you mind," she said carefully, "if I worked on your spring traps?" Gideon didn't look up from the leather. "Why?" "They're starting to rust in the joints. A couple of them will stick on you if you don't get the rust off and oil the mechanisms. Could cost you a catch. Could injure a hand if one snaps at the wrong time." A long pause. "You know traps." "My father ran lines when I was young. I helped." He looked up then. She kept her face neutral, not asking, just presenting the information. He looked back down at the leather. "Don't reorganize anything." She understood that to be permission. She worked on the traps for the better part of 2 hours, sitting on the floor near the door with the oil tin and rags, and a piece of fine sandpaper she'd found in her pack. It was careful work, satisfying in the way that fixing things was always satisfying. Not glamorous, but useful, the direct pleasure of taking something impaired and making it function again. Gideon said nothing during this time. He finished his leather work and moved on to something at the shelves, sorting and restacking. She noticed he moved quietly for a man his size, not with any obvious intention to be quiet, just as a default. The way you move when you've spent years in terrain where noise is a liability. At one point, she found a snare wire coil that had been improperly wound and would likely tangle in the field. She spent 20 minutes unwinding it and rewinding it correctly before she realized she was humming. She stopped. "Don't stop on my account," Gideon said from across the room. She turned to look at him. He was facing the shelves and she couldn't see his expression. "I didn't realize I was doing it." "I know." A brief pause. "It's been a long time since there was sound in here." She wasn't sure what to do with that. She turned back to the wire and, after a moment, started humming again. Just quietly. Something without a name. A tune her mother had used when working that she'd never thought to learn the title of. The afternoon brought a problem. Gideon came in from outside. He'd gone out twice to check something she couldn't see from the window, both times returning with the look of a man who didn't like what he'd found, and stood in the middle of the room with snow melting off his coat, and his expression shifted into something harder than the carefully neutral look he'd maintained most of the day. "What?" she asked. East Snowfield's building above the shelf rock. She knew enough to ask the right question. "Slide risk?" "Not yet. But if we get another heavy loading tonight—" He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence because she could finish it herself. "What do you do when that happens?" "I've got a lower shelter, 300 yards down the north face, built into the rock. I've waited storms out there before." He paused. "It's small." He was telling her something in the spaces between the words. She processed it. "How small?" "Meant for one." "How small?" she said again. He looked at the wall. "Tight." She thought about this. "If the slide risk develops tonight, we may need to move there." "Yes." "Together." "Yes." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Well," Mabel said, "I've been told I'm good at making the best of a situation." He looked at her with that unreadable expression. "Who told you that?" "Mostly myself." She stood and stretched her back, which was complaining about 2 hours on the plank floor. "What do we need to take if we have to move fast?" He stared at her for another second. Then he turned to the shelves and started talking about what mattered and what didn't, and she listened carefully and started making mental notes. And outside, the snow kept coming down. By nightfall, Gideon had decided the slide risk was real enough to prepare. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, packing a specific canvas bag with items selected so quickly she understood it was a practice list. Nothing thought through fresh, but everything already categorized in his mind into essential and expendable. Food for 4 days, fire-starting materials, the hunting knife, a heavy blanket, medical supplies, these in a small wooden box that she noted he handled with particular care. She watched him and helped where he didn't wave her off, which was in 1 or 2 places, handing him things from the shelf so he didn't have to cross the room twice. Small contributions. He didn't comment on them. "Your mule will be fine in the lean-to," he said, without her asking. "Structure's anchored to bedrock. She'll stay put." "All right. And the cabin itself." He paused, looking around the room with an expression she couldn't read, but that was clearly more than practical assessment. It was the look of a man regarding something that mattered. It stood through worse. She looked around too. The books on the shelf, the good stone chimney, the well-fitted logs of the walls. "You built this yourself," she said. Not a question. "Yes. It shows." She meant it as a compliment, and apparently he understood it that way because he looked at her briefly with something in his eyes that wasn't quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. The look of a man not accustomed to being praised for his work. He turned back to the pack. "We should sleep in shifts tonight. If the east snowfield starts moving, I want to hear it." "I'll take first watch," she said. He looked at her over his shoulder. "You don't have to," he said. "I know." She sat down near the fire with the coffee pot. "I told you, I'm not well designed for sitting still." He finished the pack and set it near the door. Then he went to his sleeping area, and the cabin was quiet, except for the fire and the wind and the sound of Mabel Hartwell sitting watch through the cold mountain night, listening for a sound she hoped she wouldn't hear. She didn't hear it that night. But the next 2 days were going to change everything, and somewhere in the dark above the cabin, pressed between rock and cold and the weight of accumulated snow, that change was already building toward them like something that had decided, finally, to come loose. The slide never came that night. By morning, the wind had dropped enough that the silence felt almost aggressive after hours of noise, and Mabel woke from a short, uncomfortable sleep near the fire to find Gideon already outside. She heard him before she saw him, the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood, unhurried and methodical, like a man doing what needed doing because it needed doing and not for any other reason. She got up, worked the stiffness out of her back, and made coffee. When he came in carrying an armload of split pine, he stopped briefly at the sight of the coffee pot sitting ready on the hearth. He set the wood down and poured himself a cup without comment. But he didn't turn away immediately the way he had yesterday. He stood near the fire and drank, and she sat at the table, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke, and it wasn't uncomfortable the way silence with a stranger usually is. It was just quiet. "East Snowfield?" she asked. "Settled some overnight? Wind packed the surface." He drank. "We're probably all right. Probably. Mountains don't do certainties." She accepted that and wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the sky was still low and flat, the kind of gray that meant it wasn't finished, just pausing. "The trail down won't be clear yet," he said. It wasn't an apology. He was giving her information. "I know. Maybe tomorrow, afternoon at the earliest." "All right." He looked at her over his cup. "You're not going to argue about it." Would arguing change the snow? He didn't answer that, but something shifted slightly at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, maybe. The second day was different from the first in ways that were hard to name precisely. Gideon went out in the morning to check his trap lines. He was gone nearly 3 hours, and she spent the time more usefully than she had the day before because she'd had time to look around properly and identify what actually needed doing. The shelf near the window had a board that had pulled away from its bracket at one end, not dangerously, but enough that things slid toward the low side. She found a hammer and the right-sized nail in his tool supply and fixed it in 10 minutes. The water barrel near the door had a slow weep at one of its lower staves. Not a split, just the wood having dried out and shrunk slightly, the kind of thing that would worsen over a hard winter. She packed it with a strip of her own handkerchief and the small tin of pine pitch she found among his supplies, which would hold until he could get it properly reseeded in the spring. She was reorganizing the medical box. Not the supplies, just the box itself, which had been sitting at an angle on an uneven shelf. When she stopped herself, he'd said not to reorganize anything. She put the box back where it had been, at the same angle, and moved on. When he came back, he was carrying 2 rabbits and a look on his face that was tired in a specific way, the tiredness of someone who'd expected better results and had not gotten them. He hung the rabbits near the door without speaking and started pulling off the outer layers of his gear. She had stew going already. She'd used the remaining venison from the pot, added dried beans and some of the root vegetables from the shelf, and found a small bundle of dried herbs she thought was probably sage, which she'd added carefully and not too much of. She'd asked herself twice if she was overstepping and decided twice that feeding both of them was not overstepping, it was pragmatic. Gideon stopped when he registered the smell. He looked at the pot. He looked at her. She kept her expression even. "I used the venison that was already in there," she said, "and some of the dried goods. I'll tell you exactly what so you can account for it." "I know what you used." He said it flatly but not harshly. He sat down heavily in his chair and rubbed the side of his face with one large hand. "Traps were mostly empty. Moved 2 snares. The ones I cleaned yesterday should be functioning better now." "They were." He leaned his elbows on the table. One of them had a clean catch, good spring mechanism. She recognized that for what it was. Not a thank you, exactly. Acknowledgement of a fact. She found she preferred it to a thank you. It was more honest. They ate lunch across from each other, and the conversation came easier than it had, in the way that a second day with someone always goes slightly easier than the first, when the edges aren't quite so sharp. She asked about the trap lines, and he answered, not at length but specifically, the way a person speaks when they're talking about something they know well. She asked about the property lines of what he considered his territory, and he described them in a way that made her understand he was talking about the mountain, the way most people talk about a piece of ground they've farmed for 20 years, with the particular intimacy of someone who knows where every wet spot is, where the soil goes thin, which side catches the last light. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. He thought about it, not because he didn't know, she sensed, but because the answer was complicated enough that he was deciding how much to give. 11 years, he said. She hadn't expected it to be that long. "What brought you up?" The silence this time was different, heavier. "Needed to be somewhere that wasn't somewhere else," he said, and the way he said it made clear that was all he was going to say on the subject. She nodded and let it go. She understood the feeling, even if her own version of it had looked different. There were plenty of ways to leave a place. He'd chosen one of the more drastic ones. "The books," she said after a moment. He looked up. "On the shelf near the window. You've read them." "What makes you say that?" "The spines are cracked in the middle. Pages have been turned enough times that the paper's softened at the corners. Those aren't books someone put on a shelf to have books on a shelf." Something passed through his eyes. Not annoyance, something closer to the feeling of having been seen doing something private. "Philosophy mostly," he said. "Some history." A pause. "One of them is about trees." "Trees?" "Taxonomy. What they are, how they grow, the different species, and how to tell them apart by bark and needle and cone." He looked at the table. "I already knew most of it, but the man who wrote it was careful about what he said. He didn't overstate things." A brief pause that held more weight than the words around it. "I respect that in a person." Mabel looked at him. He was studying the grain of the table with the focused attention of a man who had accidentally said something more personal than he intended. "I do too," she said simply. The afternoon brought work, and the work brought its own kind of conversation, the kind that happens when 2 people are both doing things with their hands, and the talking can come and go without needing to be managed. Gideon skinned and butchered the rabbits. Mabel worked on a length of rope near the door that had a section beginning to fray. She'd found it coiled on a peg and started working the splice without thinking about it, the same way she'd done the snare wire. He noticed but didn't say anything until she was halfway through. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "My father." She kept working. He was a teamster for 12 years before he took the homestead. Everything he knew about rope and rigging, he taught me. My brothers weren't interested. But you were. I was interested in anything useful. She paused, finding the right tension on the splice. My mother thought it was unladylike. She wasn't wrong about that. She was wrong about whether it mattered. Gideon cut a clean line through the rabbit joint and set the piece aside. People think things they don't examine, he said. They do. They look at a thing and they already have a word for it before they've actually looked. She knew he wasn't talking about rope work anymore. She kept her voice level. That happened to you often? The pause was long enough to have several different meanings. Often enough, he said. She kept working the splice and didn't push it, because she could feel that he was at the edge of something he wasn't ready to come over, and pushing would just make him back up. She'd learned that much about him in a day and a half. He moved toward things at his own pace. You could make it easier or harder for him, but you couldn't make him move faster. Late afternoon, two things happened. The first was small. She found the broken chair. She'd noticed it earlier. Not the one he used, but the second one, the chair that looked like it had been made and forgotten. She'd assumed it was just old and rough, but when she looked more carefully, she could see that one of the back legs had cracked at the joint and been left unrepaired, which was why it sat slightly wrong. The repair would take a proper wood glue and a clamp, and she didn't have either, but she could see how it should be done, and she mentioned it to Gideon not as a criticism, but as information. He stared at the chair for a moment. I know, he said. When did it break? 6 years ago. She opened her mouth, closed it, did not say what she was thinking. I don't have company, he said, which was both an explanation and a thing she was not supposed to respond to with pity. She understood that. I have wood glue in my pack, she said instead. I carry it for the medicine case. Some of the jars have wooden stoppers that crack in the cold. I could fix the leg, but you'd need to keep weight off it for a day while it sets. He looked at the chair for another moment. Then he went and got the chair and set it in front of her without speaking. She fixed it. The second thing was less small. She'd been looking out the window at the fading light, calculating trail conditions, thinking about the Keswick child, doing the arithmetic on whether she could make it by midday tomorrow. When she saw movement on the lower slope, too deliberate for an animal, the wrong rhythm for wind-moved brush. Gideon! He was across the room in fewer steps than she expected. He looked where she was looking. Riders, he said. 2 of them, moving slow. She watched them pick their way through the snow. Coming up deliberately. They know the approach. His expression had changed. The relatively open look she'd been seeing for the past day closed down the way a shutter closes. Not angry, exactly, but hardened into something that had no interest in being read. You know who they are? She asked. I have guesses. Good guesses or bad ones? He turned away from the window and went to the door. He lifted his coat off the hook and put it on with the same economical motions as everything else. But his jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. Not fear. Something older and colder than fear. Stay inside, he said. I'm not going to... Stay inside. He said it without heat, which was somehow more serious than if he'd said it hard. This is not your business yet. She registered the word yet and stayed. She watched through the window. The 2 riders reached the flat area in front of the cabin and stopped. They were bundled against the cold, but she could see that they sat their horses the way men sit horses when they're accustomed to having authority. Spines straight, not bothering to keep the horses from stamping around, certain enough of their position that the basic courtesy of controlling your animal in someone else's yard didn't seem to apply to them. Gideon stood in the open space between the cabin and the lean-to. He hadn't put his hand on anything. He just stood there the way he stood, which was its own kind of statement. She couldn't hear the words through the glass, but she could read the shape of the conversation. One of the riders was doing the talking. The other was hanging back slightly, the way a man hangs back when he's there to watch and intervene rather than negotiate. The talking rider had a paper in his hand. She could see the white rectangle of it. And at one point he leaned forward and extended it toward Gideon. Gideon didn't take it. The talking rider kept talking. Gideon didn't move. After a few minutes, the rider straightened up, said something that was clearly intended as final, and turned his horse. The second rider followed. They went back down the slope the way they'd come. Gideon stood and watched them until they disappeared into the tree line. Then he stood there a little longer. Then he came inside. He didn't take the coat off right away. He stood near the door with his back to her, and she could see the line of his shoulders, the way they carried something that hadn't been there that morning. She waited. Blackstone Land Syndicate, he said finally. Out of Colton. She knew the name. Most people in the territory did. They'd been moving through the valley counties for 2 years, acquiring property through a combination of legal purchase, legal pressure, and methods that occupied the gray area between those two categories. They want the mountain, she said. They want everything above the 600-foot survey line. He turned around. His face was composed, but something behind his eyes was working. I've had notice before. This was a follow-up. What kind of follow-up? The kind with a deadline on it. He pulled off the coat and hung it up. 30 days. Mabel sat with that. The land is filed in your name? He looked at her. I'm asking because it matters, she said. There are different kinds of 30-day notices, and they mean different things depending on whether your original claim is properly documented. It's filed. He paused. In Harlan's Crossing. Filed it the year I built this place. Have you had a lawyer look at it? The look he gave her was somewhere between dry and tired. I don't generally involve myself in town that way. I know, but a land claim is only as good as its documentation, and syndicates like this one have lawyers who know exactly where the gaps are. He sat down heavily in his chair. The fixed chair was still in the corner drying, so he had only the one, and he folded himself into it and put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. I've kept to myself up here for 11 years, he said. I haven't asked anything of anybody down there. I know. And now they want to tell me this isn't mine. She heard what was underneath that. Not outrage exactly, or not only outrage. The particular pain of someone who had found the one place in the world that made sense to him and was being told that even that wasn't safe. They're not going to just walk away, she said. That's not how syndicates like this operate. 30 days from today, if nothing has changed, they'll be back with more than 2 riders and a piece of paper. He looked up at her. I know that. So we have to think about what changes before then. He stared at her. We. She met his eyes and didn't look away. You pulled my mule in from the cold and gave her hay, and you didn't have to do that. I fixed your traps and your rope and your chair. I figure we're approximately even, which means whatever comes next, we're starting from 0. She folded her hands on the table. And I know people in Harlan's Crossing. I know the land records clerk. I know which of the 3 lawyers in town has actually won a case in the last 5 years. If your claim has holes in it, we need to know now, not on day 31. Gideon looked at her for a long time. The fire popped. Outside, the sky had gone fully dark, the wind picking back up again from the northwest. You don't know what you're getting into, he said. Probably not, she agreed. But I've noticed that not knowing what I'm getting into has never actually stopped me, so it seems like a waste of time to use it as a reason. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes hadn't moved from her face. The trail should clear by tomorrow afternoon, he said finally. I know. I'll get you down before dark. And then? Another pause. Something moving behind his eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but the early motion of something that might eventually become trust if it was given enough time and enough reasons. And then, he said, we'll see what the records say. Come. She slept better that second night, the sleep of someone who'd gone from being a problem to being, however provisionally, a participant. The fire burned low and steady, and the wind outside was just wind, not a threat. And somewhere below them on the mountain, the Blackstone Land Syndicate's 2 riders were moving back toward Colton with their unanswered paper. Gideon slept too eventually. She heard his breathing shift sometime around midnight, and she lay there for a while listening to the cabin settle in the cold and thinking about land deeds and 30-day notices and what a woman who knew the records clerk was actually worth in a fight like this. More than nothing, she decided, at least more than nothing. The trail down took most of the morning. Gideon went first, breaking path through the drifted sections, and Mabel followed on perseverance with her pack resettled and the medical kit still intact. He didn't speak much on the descent, which she'd come to understand was simply how he moved through terrain, focused, reading the ground ahead, not wasting attention on words when the mountain required it. She didn't push conversation. She watched how he chose his footing and learned things about the slope she wouldn't have figured out on her own. At the tree line, he stopped and pointed northeast. Keswick Homestead is 4 miles that direction. Trail stays visible from here. I know it from this point, she said. He nodded. He looked like he was going to turn back. Gideon. She waited until he looked at her. Come to Harlan's Crossing in the next few days. Don't wait on it. Find me at the post office. I work the afternoon counter Tuesday through Friday. We need to look at your claim documents before anything else. He looked at her with that evaluating expression she'd learned to read as him actually thinking rather than refusing. I don't do well in town. I know. Come anyway. She gathered her reins. 3 days. Don't make me ride back up that mountain. Something crossed his face that she thought might be the closest thing to flustered she'd ever see from him. She turned perseverance toward the Keswick Trail before he could find a response to that. The Keswick child's fever had broken 2 days prior. Mabel learned this from Clara Keswick herself, a thin, red-haired woman who opened the door with tired eyes and then grabbed Mabel's hands with genuine relief when she saw who it was. They'd managed it with cold compresses and the last of their own willow bark, Clara said, but it had been close enough on the second night that her husband had sat up until dawn. They fed Mabel a hot meal and pressed a jar of preserved plums on her that she tried to refuse and couldn't. Riding back to Harlan's Crossing, the plums balanced across her saddlebag, she thought about land syndicates and records clerks, and a man with a broken chair he hadn't fixed in 6 years because he didn't expect company. Harlan's Crossing in winter was a town that had pulled in on itself like a fist. The wide main street, which was almost cheerful in summer, looked exposed and raw in February. The storefronts hunkered under their eaves, horses standing hip-shot at the rail with their tails turned to the wind. Mabel stabled Perseverance, went home to change clothes and eat something that wasn't trail food, and then walked straight to the land records office before it closed. Thomas Eddy, the records clerk, was a small, precise man who had worked that office for 9 years and knew its contents the way some men know Scripture, completely and without needing to look. He found Gideon's claim in 4 minutes. Voss, original filing, 11 years back. He spread the papers on the counter, and they both looked at them. Survey notation, primary structure, seasonal access easements. He tapped a line near the bottom of the second page. Here's a problem. She leaned in. Boundary notation references a survey stake that was recorded by the county in the original filing, but there's no confirmatory survey on file after the first year. County required a follow-up survey at 12 months for claims above the 500-foot elevation line. Didn't happen. He looked up at her over his glasses. It's not void. The claim isn't void, but it's got a procedural deficiency that a good syndicate lawyer is going to use as a crowbar. She stared at the paper. What fixes it? A current survey, properly filed, with the boundary stakes confirmed, gets the record clean. He paused. Cost you about $40 and 3 weeks for the surveyor to get up there and back in this weather. Does Harlan's Crossing have a surveyor? Remy Ashford. He's good. Slow, but good. She looked at the paper another moment. Keep this out where I can come back to it. He gave her the look of a man who had been asked to do something mildly irregular, but not actually wrong. He put the papers back in their sleeve, but left the sleeve on the top of the corresponding stack, rather than filing it back in the drawer. Gideon came to town on the second day, not the third. She was behind the post counter sorting incoming freight when the room changed. She noticed it before she saw him, the way a couple of men near the door went quiet and found reasons to look at the floor, the way old Hester Prain, who was waiting for her mail package, suddenly became extremely interested in the wall. Mabel finished writing the manifest number on the parcel she was holding and looked up. He'd made some concession to being in town. His beard was slightly less unruly than it had been, and he'd left the enormous coat somewhere, wearing instead a heavy canvas jacket that was large but at least had the shape of a garment a person might wear into a building. He still filled the doorframe. He still had the face that people's eyes skidded away from. He looked at the room with the flat, contained expression of a man who had known exactly what he was walking into and had come anyway. His eyes found her. She put down the parcel. Give me 10 minutes, she said to the room in general, meaning nobody in particular, meaning she was leaving and didn't require permission. She came around the counter and walked toward him, and he moved to the side to let her pass, and they went out together, which produced a silence behind them that she knew without looking would immediately become noise. Records office first, she said. Then I want you to talk to Ben Holler. Who's Ben Holler? Lawyer. He's won 7 of his last 9 cases, which is as good as it gets in this county. She was walking at a pace she had to consciously keep from being too fast. His stride was considerably longer than hers, and she refused to trot. He's also honest, which is rarer than the winning record. Gideon was looking at the street, at the people who were looking at him, and then looking away, with the practiced neutrality of someone who had long since stopped expecting anything different. I don't have $40, he said. It cost him something to say it. She could hear that. I know, that's what Holler is for. If the claim is solid enough, he can make the argument that the syndicate's filing triggers a legal obligation to provide corrective survey access. It's a stretch, but it's not an impossible stretch. She stopped at the records office door. Also, I might be able to cover the survey fee temporarily, as a loan. He stopped. He looked at her with an expression that was not gratitude. It was the expression of a person trying to figure out why someone would do this, working through possible motivations and not landing on one that made complete sense. Why? He said. It was a fair question. She thought about how to answer it honestly. Because what they're doing is wrong, and someone should do something about it, she said. And because you gave my mule hay when you didn't have to. She pushed open the records door. I told you we were starting from zero. This is starting from zero. He looked at her for another second. Then he followed her inside. Thomas Eddy was professionally unruffled by Gideon's presence, which Mabel had counted on. The man had the bureaucratic temperament of someone who categorized everything and was surprised by nothing. He laid out the papers and walked Gideon through the deficiency with the same precise calm he'd used with her. Gideon listened without speaking. He looked at the papers carefully. He was not, she noticed, a man who pretended to understand things he didn't. He asked 2 specific questions, both of them good ones, and Eddy answered them without condescension. So my claim is real, Gideon said at the end. It's real, Eddy confirmed. It has a procedural gap that creates legal vulnerability. Those are different things. The syndicate's lawyers know about the gap. Almost certainly. That's what they paid people to find. Gideon looked at the paper for a long moment. What's the name of their lawyer? Croft, Gerald Croft. He's out of Colton, and he's been handling their acquisitions for 2 years. He ever lose? Eddy adjusted his glasses. 3 times in 12. He's good. Gideon nodded once, the nod of a man absorbing information rather than responding to it. He straightened up. He looked at Mabel. She looked back and gave him nothing. He had to make this decision himself. Set up the survey, he said. On. Ben Holler had an office above the hardware store that smelled of paper and wood oil, and the pipe he smoked but never actually lit, just held in his teeth while he thought. He was 52 years old and had the look of a man who had heard most things twice and still paid attention. He read the claim documents in about 4 minutes, asked Gideon the same questions Eddy had asked and several additional ones, and then leaned back in his chair. Here's what I can tell you, he said. The claim is defensible. With a corrective survey on file, it's strongly defensible. Without it, Croft will tie this up in procedural challenges for 6 months minimum, and in 6 months the Blackstone Syndicate will have occupied half the approaches to your land through a series of what they'll call temporary working easements that will stop being temporary. He set the papers down. I've seen it done twice in this county. They don't need to win outright. They just need to make it expensive and inconvenient enough that you give up. I'm not giving up, Gideon said. Then we get the survey done and filed inside of 3 weeks, and we respond to their notice formally through my office, which forces them to engage legally rather than just showing up with more riders. He looked at Mabel. You're fronting the survey fee. Temporarily. As a loan. Does he know that Remy Ashford has never been above the 700-foot line in winter? I'll go with him, Gideon said. Holler looked at him with the frank assessment of a man deciding whether to believe a thing or not. He apparently decided to. All right. He picked up a pen. Let's start the response letter. The days that followed were a different kind of difficult. Mabel had thought the hard part was getting Gideon to come down the mountain and engage with the legal machinery. She'd been partly right. The harder part turned out to be what happened in Harlan's Crossing while all of it was in motion. The Blackstone Syndicate had people in town. Not residents, she'd have known if they were residents, but visitors who stayed at the Granger Hotel and asked questions of the kind that weren't quite threatening but were clearly meant to establish what kind of resistance they were dealing with. They talked to Calloway at the livery. They talked to the men at the saloon. They talked to Hester Prane, who told them nothing useful but told everyone else in town exactly what they'd asked, because Hester Prane had the information habits of a weather vane. On the fourth day after Gideon's visit, a man named Vickers came to the post office. He was well-dressed in the way that men on syndicate business were often well-dressed. New coat, good boots, the kind of grooming that came from a hotel with a decent barber. He waited until the other customers had collected their mail and left, and then he came to the counter. "Miss Hartwell," he said pleasantly. "That's me. My name is Carl Vickers. I represent Blackstone Land and Development." He put a card on the counter. She didn't pick it up. "I understand you've been helping a man named Voss navigate some property paperwork." "I help people with things," she said. "It's a small town. People help each other." "Of course." He smiled the smile of a man who did this professionally. "I just wanted to make sure you have all the relevant information. The Voss claim has some significant legal complexities that could make this process quite drawn out, quite costly. A pause that was clearly designed. For everyone involved." She looked at him. "Is that a threat, Mr. Vickers?" "Absolutely not." The smile didn't change. "I'm offering clarity. Mr. Voss's situation up on that mountain. A man alone, no community ties, a property claim with documented procedural gaps. It's precarious. And people in precarious situations sometimes make decisions that protect them in the short term and cost them considerably more in the long term." He straightened the card on the counter with one finger. "I'm hoping to spare everyone that kind of trouble." "I appreciate your concern," Mabel said. "The answer is no." He looked at her for a moment. Some of the professional pleasantness went out of his expression, not into anger but into a more neutral appraisal. He picked up the card. "We'll be in touch," he said, and left. She stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed, her hands flat on the surface, her pulse slightly higher than she'd have liked. She rode up to the cabin that evening, which she hadn't originally planned to do. The trail was better now than it had been. The hard pack of the last storm had settled into something that was navigable if you went carefully, and she made it to the cabin in under 2 hours. Gideon opened the door before she knocked, which meant he'd heard her coming, which she was learning to expect. "Vickers came to see me," she said, stepping inside. He closed the door. He looked at her face and she saw him read it correctly. Not panic, but information. "What did he say?" She told him, word for word, the way her father had taught her to relay important conversations. You don't editorialize, you report, because the other person needs to hear the actual words and draw their own conclusions. When she finished, Gideon was quiet for a moment. He was standing near the fireplace and he put one hand on the mantel, not leaning, more anchoring, the way you touch something solid when you're thinking hard. "They're going to move faster now," he said. "I think so. Because they know you're involved, and that changes the kind of problem they have." He looked at the fire. "A man alone up a mountain, that's one kind of problem. A man with someone who knows the records clerk and a lawyer and is willing to make noise, that's different." "Yes." He turned to look at her. "You should step back from this." She pulled off her coat. "No." "Mabel, I've thought about it," she said, which was true. She'd thought about it the entire ride up. "Vickers came to warn me off, which means they're worried about me, which means I'm doing something useful. I don't step back from useful." He looked at her with an expression that was complicated in ways she couldn't fully read. Frustration, probably, and something else. Something that looked like it might be concern. Not for the land, for her. "They don't play clean," he said. "I know that. I mean it. These aren't people who are going to stay at the level of polite visits and legal letters. I understand. She hung her coat on the peg nearest the door. She'd started using that peg, she realized, as if it were her peg. She left it there. But I think there are other people in this valley who are looking at the same problem you have. The Kesslers, the Whitmore brothers who run the upper grazing claims. Maybe 3 or 4 homesteads up along the eastern ridge that are probably in the same position you are. Filed claim, no follow-up survey, sitting targets for Croft in his paperwork. She sat down at the table. If this is just about you, it's a hard fight. If it's about a pattern of what the syndicate has been doing to everyone up here, that's a different kind of case. He was very still on the other side of the room. You're talking about getting other people involved, he said. I'm talking about the fact that other people are already involved. They just don't know it yet. She looked at him directly. You know the mountain better than anyone. You know who's up here, where their claims are, how long they've been there. I know the town. I know the records. I know who to talk to. She paused. That's not nothing. The silence stretched long enough to be a real silence. Then Gideon pulled out his chair and sat down across from her, and she understood that was an answer, even without words. Outside, the wind was moving through the pines in that low particular sound she'd started to think of as the mountain's voice. Not threatening, just present, reminding anyone listening that it was still there, that it had been there before the syndicate and before all of them, and that whatever happened next, the ground itself wasn't going anywhere. She pulled her notebook from her coat pocket and put it on the table. Tell me who's up here, she said. And Gideon Voss, who had kept to himself for 11 years and expected nothing from people and been proven right often enough to make a habit of it, began to talk. The list Gideon gave her that night ran to 11 names. Not all of them were people he knew well. Some were men he'd seen from a distance. Homesteads he knew existed because he'd tracked game past their fence lines. Claim markers he'd noted over 11 years of moving through the mountain without ever having reason to knock on anyone's door. But he knew the land, and he knew where people had put down roots in it. And when Mabel spread her notebook open and started writing, he talked for nearly an hour without stopping in a way that she suspected he hadn't talked in years. The Kesslers she already knew. The Whitmore brothers ran a grazing operation on the eastern slope. 200 acres of high summer pasture that was worth considerably more than it looked if you understood how few good grazing approaches existed above the 500-foot line. A man named Pruitt had a mining claim on the north face, nothing productive yet, but registered and filed. The Garza family, husband, wife, 3 children, had homesteaded a south-facing bench 2 years prior and were still in the stage where one bad season could end them. 4 other names she didn't recognize, smaller operations, people who had come to the mountain for the same reasons people always came to places like this, to be left alone with a piece of ground and a chance. She wrote all of it down. Then she looked at the list and thought about what Haller had said, that the syndicate didn't need to win outright, they just needed to make it expensive enough that people quit. She thought about 11 families or individuals, each of them sitting alone on their separate claim, each of them probably aware something was wrong, but not aware that everyone around them was in the same position. Do any of these people know each other? She asked. Gideon thought about it. Whitmore brothers know Pruitt. They've traded labor before during heavy work. He paused. Garza family. The wife came down to Harlan's Crossing in October for supplies. I saw her at Calloway's. She looked worried. Did you talk to her? A beat. No. She didn't press that. All right. I'll start with the ones I can get to from town. You take the ones that are mountain accessible. She looked up at him. That means you have to actually go knock on people's doors. He looked at the table. Gideon, I know that's not how you operate. It's not that, he said. He said it in a way that suggested it was at least partly that, but also something else. These people have heard things about me. They're going to open their doors and see me standing there, and they're going to be scared before I say a word. She put the pen down. She looked at him straight. Then you'll have to say words that are better than what they expect, which I think you can do. She paused. You said something to me on that mountain that made me feel less like a burden and more like a person making a practical choice. You didn't do it on purpose, and you didn't try hard, but you did it. A beat. Do it on purpose this time. He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between uncomfortable and something else she'd started to notice in the last few days. The look of a man who had been seen more clearly than he was accustomed to and couldn't decide yet how he felt about it. "That's not the same thing," he said. "Close enough," she said. "Start with Pruitt. He's nearest to you, and miners tend to be practical people." It took 8 days to reach all 11. Mabel handled town and the lower approaches. She found Elena Garza at the dry goods store on a Wednesday afternoon, a small, dark-haired woman with the kind of tired alertness that comes from maintaining vigilance for a long time. When Mabel explained what she'd found in the records and what Haller had told her, Elena was quiet for a long moment, and then said, in a voice very carefully controlled, "We received a letter 2 weeks ago. My husband thought it was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," Mabel said. "Can your husband come to a meeting in town?" Elena looked at her. "Who else is coming?" "Everyone in the same situation, which is more people than you'd think." The Kesslers she found at home, and they were angry in the specifically tired way of people who had already been afraid and were relieved to have someone to be angry at instead. The elder Whitmore brother, the younger one had gone to Colton for the month, listened to her on his porch in the cold without expression, and then said, "Who's handling the legal side?" And when she said Ben Haller, he nodded once like that was the correct answer and said he'd be at the meeting. Gideon's route was harder. She didn't know the details of most of his conversations because he didn't report them in detail. He came to town 4 days in and told her Pruitt was in, 2 of the other claims were in, and one man named Sorensen had refused to open his door and shouted through it that he wanted nothing to do with Gideon Voss or anyone connected to him. She watched Gideon's face when he said that, and watched him keep the face neutral with the practiced effort of someone doing it deliberately. "That's one," she said. "What about the others?" "Garza's husband rode up to find me. Apparently his wife had already talked to you." Something in his expression shifted. "He shook my hand." She kept her face even. "Good. It was—" He stopped, started again. "I wasn't expecting it." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "You told them to expect me." "I told Elena Garza that you were the one who'd flagged the problem and that you knew the mountain better than anyone up here, and that if they had questions about the land itself, you were the person to ask." She shrugged. "All of that is true." He was quiet for a second. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She picked up her coat. "Meeting is Saturday at Haller's office. He says it's big enough if people don't mind standing. But 9 people came on Saturday." The office was not, as it turned out, big enough for 9 people to stand comfortably, but they managed, crowded around Haller's desk and along the walls, coats still on, breath visible in the air before the small stove got going properly. Mabel stood near the window. Gideon stood near the door, which she suspected was a choice about having an exit available if he needed it. Haller laid it out plainly, which was what she'd hired him for. The procedural deficiencies, the syndicate's pattern across the county, what a coordinated legal response looked like versus 9 individual filings that could be picked apart one at a time. He didn't oversell it. He told them it would cost money and time they probably didn't have, and that even with everything done correctly, there would be a period of legal uncertainty where the syndicate would try pressure tactics. "What kind of pressure tactics?" Pruitt asked. He was a compact man in his 40s who looked like he'd built his face from practical experience rather than good fortune. "Supply disruption, most likely," Haller said. "They'll try to establish control over the Valley Road access points, make it harder to get goods in and out, create enough discomfort that people recalculate whether the land is worth the fight." "They can't do that," Elena Garza said. "They can make it difficult without technically doing anything illegal. That's what this kind of operation is good at." The room was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of people absorbing bad news. "So we need alternative supply lines," Mabel said. She'd been thinking about this since the vicar's visit. "Routes that don't go through the Valley Road, which means we need to know the mountain." She looked at Gideon. Every face in the room turned toward him. She watched him absorb that, the weight of 9 people looking at him, waiting. His jaw was set and his hands were still at his sides, and he looked back at the room with an expression that was not comfortable but was present, which was what mattered. "There are 3 alternative approaches," he said. His voice was flat but steady. "One from the north through the Miller Pass watershed, adds 4 miles but bypasses the Valley Road entirely. one from the east that connects to the Colton Freight Trail, usable in dry conditions and in winter if you know which sections ice first, and one that most people don't know about because it looks like a dead end. He paused. It's not. You'd share that, the elder Whitmore said. It wasn't quite skepticism, more like a man checking whether a thing was real before he put weight on it. I'm sharing it right now, Gideon said. The room shifted. Not dramatically. People didn't cheer or visibly relax. But something changed in the quality of the attention, the angle of it. Like a group of people who had come in expecting one thing and were recalibrating toward another. The syndicate moved 3 weeks later. Holler had warned them it was coming, and Mabel had warned Gideon, and Gideon had spent those 3 weeks doing something she hadn't asked him to do and hadn't expected. He'd gone back to each of the 11 claims individually, not to talk, but to help. He'd spent 2 days helping Pruitt reinforce his mine entrance against winter collapse. He'd helped the Garza family repair a section of fence that had been pushed over by elk and never gotten fixed because there was always something more urgent. Small things. The kind of things a neighbor does, except that for 11 years he hadn't been anyone's neighbor. She found out about most of it third hand from the people themselves when they came to town. Elena Garza mentioned it in passing. That big man Voss, he came and helped Mateo with the fence, with a tone that was not quite wondering but was close. Mabel filed it away and didn't mention it to Gideon. The syndicate's move came on a Thursday in the form of 3 riders who took positions at the main Valley Road entry point and began, with all the professional plausibility of men following instructions, to delay anyone moving supplies up to the mountain claims. Not stopping them. That would be too obviously actionable. Just asking questions, checking loads, finding reasons. An hour's delay here, 2 hours there. In summer, that was an inconvenience. In winter, with light running short and temperatures dropping, it was the beginning of something worse. By Friday morning, Mabel had ridden to Gideon's cabin and back. By Friday afternoon, the 11 families and claims on the mountain were moving their supply runs through the Miller Pass watershed route, guided by handwritten notes that Gideon had prepared. She'd watched him do it, sitting at his table with the particular care of someone who doesn't write much and knows it matters when they do, describing landmarks and distances and the sections where the trail got uncertain. The riders at the Valley Road entry stayed for 4 days. By then, they'd delayed a total of perhaps 60 hours of travel and disrupted exactly nothing, because there was nothing coming through the Valley Road to disrupt. They left on Monday. The real confrontation came 10 days after that. It was, as these things tend to be, not the dramatic showdown anyone would have planned for, but a messy and cold and logistically complicated situation that required decisions faster than decisions could be properly made. A storm had been building for 2 days, not the same scale as the one that had stranded Mabel, smaller, but with worse ice underneath, the kind that turned the Miller Pass approach dangerous at its middle section where the trail ran across a shelf of exposed rock. Gideon had flagged that specific section in his notes. He'd also said it could be managed if you knew where to rope and where to go wide. The Garza family, moving their monthly supply load on the Friday before the storm peaked, hit the ice section in the early afternoon. Their horse went down, not injured badly, but badly enough to lose its footing and slide partway off the trail with 200 pounds of supplies still tied to it, and Mateo Garza alone on the ledge trying to hold the lead line with both hands and losing. A trapper named Hollis, who had a claim Mabel hadn't known about, saw it from below and rode hard to find Gideon, who was the closest help he could think of. Mabel was at the cabin when they arrived. She'd come up that morning to go over the survey results with Gideon. Remy Ashford had filed the corrective survey 2 days prior, which meant the legal position was now substantially stronger, and she'd wanted to work through Haller's latest letter with him while it was fresh. She was sitting at the table with coffee when Hollis came through the door at a near run and said the Garza horse was down on the ice shelf and Mateo couldn't hold it much longer. Gideon was moving before Hollis finished the sentence. She grabbed her coat and followed. The shelf section was 20 minutes at speed through terrain that punished speed. Gideon ran it in a way that she could barely keep up with, like, not recklessly, but with the terrifying efficiency of someone who knew every step of this ground and could commit to it fully. She kept him in sight and kept moving and tried not to think about the ice under her boots. They heard Mateo before they saw him, his voice carrying over the shelf rock, low and strained. The particular sound of a person putting everything they have into a physical effort that's very slowly losing. The horse had slid about 8 feet off the trail edge and was jammed against a rock outcrop that was the only thing stopping it going further. The animal was panicking in a contained way, the way horses panic when they can't go anywhere, trembling, eyes wild, but not thrashing because some part of its brain understood that thrashing was worse. The supply packs were half off, and the rope connecting them to Mateo's saddle horn on the trail above was twisted and wrong. Gideon took in the geometry of it in about 3 seconds. "Rope," he said to Hollis, who had caught up and was carrying a length of it. He took it and went over the edge of the shelf without ceremony, using his weight and the rock features she wouldn't have been able to identify as usable, and reached the horse in a descent that should have taken twice as long as it did. Mabel had gone to Mateo. The man's hands were bleeding where the rope had cut through his gloves. She took the rope from him, and he let her have it, and stood there with the kind of shaking that's not cold, but the release of sustained effort. "The packs," she said to him. "When Gideon gets the horse steady, the packs first. Tell me what's breakable." "Medicine kit," he said, still breathing hard. "Top left pack." She looked over the edge. Gideon had the horse's head. He was talking to it. She could see his mouth moving, low and close to the animal's ear. And the horse had stopped trembling in the absolute way it had been, and was instead just scared, which was manageable. He got a loop of Hollis's rope around the horse's barrel and looked up. She caught his eye and held up one finger. He understood. One person's weight on the trail side of the rope as anchor. He nodded. It took 35 minutes. The packs came up first, passed hand over hand up the shelf. The horse came up last, with Gideon below it and Mateo and Hollis and Mabel above. On the rope together, pulling in the rhythm Gideon called. Not words, just a sound, a timing signal, the way you coordinate effort when you don't have time for words. The horse made the trail and immediately tried to walk away as if nothing had happened. Mabel held the lead and led it. Gideon came up over the shelf edge and stood on the trail and looked at the situation. Horse standing, supplies intact, Mateo upright, with the expression of a man confirming that the arithmetic added up correctly. He was breathing hard. He had blood on one hand from where the rock had taken skin. Mateo Garza looked at him for a moment. His eyes were red at the edges, whether from cold or something else she couldn't say. He reached out and gripped Gideon's arm just below the shoulder, the way men grip each other when shaking hands isn't enough. Gideon looked at the grip. Then he looked at Mateo's face. "Thank you," Mateo said. Simple and direct. Gideon didn't say "you're welcome." He said, "Get off the shelf before the storm peaks. Take the lower junction at the pine split. The ice doesn't build there." Mateo nodded. He held the grip another second before releasing it. They walked back together, the 4 of them, Hollis leading the horse because Mateo's hands needed a rest. The storm was building above them, the clouds coming in heavy and fast from the northwest, and the light was going gray in that way that meant 2 hours of useful visibility at most. Mabel walked beside Gideon. He was quiet, which was normal, but the quality of the quiet was different from usual. Fuller, somehow, like a container that had something in it. "Your hand," she said. He looked at it. The skin was off 2 knuckles, and the cold had kept the bleeding slow. "It's fine." "I know it's fine. It should still be cleaned when we get back." He didn't argue. They walked for a while without speaking. The trail curved around a stand of spruce, and the wind dropped momentarily in the shelter of them. And in that brief quiet, she heard him say something she almost missed. "I didn't know their horse's name." She turned to look at him. "I was talking to it on the shelf," he said, trying to settle it down. "I kept thinking I should use its name, but I didn't know it." He looked forward at the trail. "If I'd known these people better, if I'd been the kind of person who knew their horse's name, I would have had it faster." She walked beside him for a moment, thinking about that. "What's Perseverance doing right now?" he said. "The shift was so abrupt it took her a second to track it. Probably standing in my stable eating hay and judging everyone who walks by." "She does that," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You noticed that?" Hard to miss. She felt something settle in her chest. Not quite warmth, not quite relief. something that was its own category, particular to this mountain in these days, and this man who had just said the thing he'd said about a horse's name in the voice of someone discovering something about himself that surprised him. "We'll figure out the legal end," she said. "Holler is good, and the survey is filed. The syndicate's going to have to actually win in court, which is different from just wearing people down." "I know." "And you have 9 people now who know the alternative routes and have seen what a coordinated response looks like." She paused. 10, counting me. He walked another 20 feet before he said anything. "I built this place to be alone," he said. "That was the whole point of it." She waited. "I'm finding that the point has changed." He said it like a man stating a geographical fact, something that was simply true about the terrain. "I'm not sure when it changed." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "I have a guess." "I know you do." A pause. "You're probably right." The cabin came into view through the trees, the smoke from the chimney going sideways in the wind, the warm orange of the window light visible even in the late afternoon gray. He'd built it well. It had held through everything the mountain sent at it. She thought about that. The hearing was set for the second Tuesday of March. Haller had filed the coordinated response in late February. 9 claims, 9 corrective surveys, 1 consolidated legal argument that the Blackstone Land Syndicate's notices were procedurally defective on the same grounds they'd tried to use against the claimants themselves. It was, as Haller put it with the restrained satisfaction of a man who enjoyed this kind of symmetry, a reasonable argument that had become a strong argument the moment Croft's own filings revealed he'd used an outdated county survey map as his baseline, an outdated map that placed 2 of the 9 claims outside the legal boundary he was trying to establish, which meant 2 of his core arguments were built on a foundation that didn't match the actual ground. Remy Ashford's corrective surveys had done that. Slow, careful, accurate work, done in February, cold, with Gideon breaking trail ahead of him and pointing out survey stake locations from memory. Mabel had stayed up until past midnight, 3 nights running, going through the filings with Haller, checking every reference, every date, every notation. Her eyes had gone red and her handwriting had deteriorated badly by the 3rd night. And at one point, Haller had looked at her across his desk and said, "You know, most people who come in here just tell me what they want and let me do the rest." "I know," she'd said, and kept reading. Gideon had come to town the Monday before the hearing. He'd never been in a courthouse before, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He told her that flatly on the walk from the stable, the same way he said most things. She appreciated it. She'd have appreciated it less if he'd been performing calm he didn't feel, which would have made her feel worse about the whole situation. "Haller does the talking," she told him. "You sit there. If the judge asks you something directly, answer it simply and don't add to it." "I know how to answer a question." "You know how to answer a question when you're in your cabin. Courts are different. Everything you say becomes part of a record. People read tone into things." He looked at the courthouse building from across the street. It was a modest structure, 2 stories, with the territorial flag above the door. "They're going to look at me," he said. "Yes. And they're going to have already decided what I am. Some of them. The judge is what matters, and I've watched Haller in front of Judge Aldrich twice. Aldrich doesn't decide anything before he sees the paperwork." She paused. "He also doesn't like syndicates. Not on principle. He just dislikes when large organizations use procedural complexity to override straightforward property rights. It's a personal irritation with him." Gideon looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Thomas Eddy told me. Records clerks hear everything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What happens if we lose?" She'd thought about this. She'd spent some time in the dark of several recent mornings thinking about it. If Aldrich rules against the consolidated filing, Haller has 2 more approaches. It gets more expensive and slower. But the surveys are filed now. The procedural deficiency in your claim is closed. That part of their leverage is gone permanently, regardless of what happens today. That's not an answer. "I know." She looked at the courthouse. "If we lose today, it gets harder, but it doesn't get over." He nodded. It was the nod she'd come to know. Not agreement, acknowledgement. He was taking in the information and choosing to keep moving. The courtroom held about 40 people. It held 51 that morning. The Whitmore brothers were there. Pruitt. The Garzas, both of them. Elena with her hands folded in her lap and the precise stillness of a woman conserving everything for what mattered. The Kesslers. 6 or 7 people Mabel recognized from the mountain without knowing their claims. A handful of Harlan's Crossing residents who had come the way people come to public proceedings in small towns, not because they had standing, but because it was happening, and they lived here. Gerald Croft was at the opposing table. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s, with the sharp, organized look of a man who treated cases like engineering problems. He had 2 assistants. He did not look concerned, which told her he thought he had the stronger position, or that he was good at looking like he did. Vickers was in the gallery. He caught her eye when she sat down and gave her a small nod that she did not return. Gideon sat between her and Haller and looked at the room with his hands flat on the table and his face composed. She could feel the effort that composure cost him. She didn't say anything about it. Judge Aldrich came in, and the room stood and then sat, and he opened the proceedings with the brisk efficiency of a man who had a full docket and a limited appetite for theater. Haller presented first. He was not a dramatic lawyer. He didn't perform, didn't reach for resonance when plain language served. He laid out the consolidated claim, the corrective surveys, the defects in the syndicate's baseline map. He was methodical and clear. Aldrich asked 4 questions, all specific, and Haller answered all 4 without hesitation, which Mabel noted as a good sign. Croft argued that the corrective surveys filed after the syndicate's notice period had begun should be considered procedurally untimely. It was a reasonable argument. Mabel had expected it, and so had Haller, and he addressed it in his rebuttal with a county precedent from 8 years prior that said corrective surveys filed within the calendar year of notice were valid unless the opposing party could demonstrate material prejudice. Croft had not demonstrated material prejudice. He'd assumed he wouldn't have to. Aldrich recessed for 30 minutes. Those 30 minutes were the longest of several recent weeks. People in the gallery talked quietly. Croft conferred with his assistants. Mabel looked at the middle distance and went over every argument she could remember and tried to find the holes. Gideon said quietly, to no one in particular, "The horse's name is Cobre." She turned to look at him. "I asked Mateo," he said, "last week when I went up to check the Miller Pass markers. His horse's name is Cobra." He was looking at the front of the courtroom, his face still composed. "I wanted to know it." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her chest did the thing it had been doing intermittently for weeks, the thing she'd been filing away as not the right time to examine. "That's a good name for a horse," she said. "It is," he agreed. Aldrich came back in. The ruling was not a complete victory. She'd told herself not to expect one, and she'd been right. Aldrich found for the consolidated claims on the primary question, the syndicate's baseline map defect invalidated the 2 affected notices, and the corrective surveys on all 9 claims were timely filed and legally valid. The core of what they'd built held. On the question of the syndicate's remaining 7 notices, the ones not affected by the map defect, he found that the procedural timeline required additional briefing. It was not a defeat. It was a continuation. Haller had 3 weeks to file a supplemental argument. Croft left without speaking to anyone. His assistants packed their documents with the fast movements of people who would be making phone calls before they reached the door. Vickers had already gone, she noticed, sometime during the ruling, quietly, the way people leave when they're recalculating. The room was doing something she hadn't expected. People were talking to each other, not celebrating exactly. The situation was too unfinished for that, but talking. The Kesslers with the elder Whitmore, Pruitt with 2 of the claim holders she barely knew. Elena Garza had found Mabel and taken her hand and was saying something in a mix of Spanish and English that Mabel caught enough of to understand. She caught Gideon's eye across the room. He was standing near the wall in the way he often stood in rooms, near an exit, slightly apart. But he was watching the room, not with the flat closed-off expression she'd first seen through his doorway that night in the storm. Something different. The expression of a man watching something he had a hand in and was still deciding how to hold that fact. She crossed to him. "It's not done," he said. "No. 3 more weeks and then whatever Croft puts up next." Yes. He looked at the room again. Pruitt had shaken hands with someone she didn't recognize. The Garza children. She hadn't realized they'd come, hadn't seen them until now, were sitting on a bench along the wall, the youngest one asleep against her brother's shoulder. They came down from the mountain for this, Gideon said. Not quite wondering, not quite not. They did. Because it affects them. Because it affects all of us, she said. That's different from it just affecting each of them separately. That's what you helped make different. He looked at her. His expression was the complicated one she'd learned to read as him thinking something he hadn't fully worked out yet. I knocked on some doors and showed a man where to rope across a shelf of ice. You knew which doors to knock on and you went and did it. Don't diminish it. She kept her voice level. You also know this mountain in a way that nobody else does, and you shared that. And because of it, 9 families have supply routes that the syndicate can't easily choke. That's not nothing. That's the reason we're standing here with a partial win instead of a full loss. He was quiet for a moment. Haller's going to need the supplemental brief, he said. He'll write it. He'll need the survey documentation cross-referenced to the original claim filings. The dates need to be matched exactly. I noticed a discrepancy in 2 of the filing dates when we were going through the paperwork last week. She stared at him. You noticed a discrepancy. I read carefully. You said everything in the record matters. He looked at her. Was I wrong? No, she said. You were not wrong. We need to tell Haller right now. The supplemental brief took Haller 2 weeks instead of 3. The date discrepancy Gideon had flagged turned out to matter more than either of them had anticipated. It was a clerical error in the syndicate's original filing that had been carried forward through every subsequent document, meaning a 4-year accumulation of legal paperwork was internally inconsistent on a foundational date. Croft's response when Haller raised it in the brief was, according to Haller, uncharacteristically delayed, which was itself a kind of answer. The second ruling came on a Thursday afternoon in late March. Aldrich found for the consolidated claims on all remaining counts. The syndicate's notices were void. The 9 claims stood. The corrective surveys were on record permanently. Haller sent a letter. She read it standing at the post office counter and then sat down on the stool behind the counter and read it again. What? She rode up to tell Gideon herself. She could have sent word through Hollis or Pruitt, who made regular runs up the north face now. She went herself. He was splitting wood when she arrived, the same rhythm she'd first heard through his door on the night of the storm, unhurried and methodical. He looked up when she rode in. He put the axe down. She didn't make him wait. We won. He stood very still for a moment, the kind of still that isn't the absence of feeling but its presence, held. All of it? All of it. Claims are clean, syndicate's notices are void. She swung down from perseverance. Haller thinks they're done in this county. The map defect and the filing inconsistency together, Croft's reputation took damage. That kind of thing travels. Gideon looked at the mountain above the cabin. The late March light was different from February. Still cold, but with an angle to it that had something in it besides pure endurance. The snow line had pulled back slightly on the south face. Small things. Enough. He said, I'd like to show you something. She tied perseverance. Show me. Bochum. He took her up a trail she hadn't been on before, narrow and winding, north of the cabin and up through a stand of old fir. It was maybe 20 minutes of climbing, and she was breathing hard by the end, but didn't say anything about it. At the top, the trees opened onto a small flat bench of rock, south-facing, sheltered on 3 sides by the ridge. The view from it covered the entire valley, Harlan's Crossing visible as a scatter of structures and smoke in the middle distance, the river catching light to the east, the mountain falling away in long sweeping slopes in every direction. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. I found this the second winter I was here, he said. He was standing slightly behind her, looking at the same view. I used to come up here when I needed to think. It's the only place on the mountain where you can see all of it at once. A pause. The valley and the high country together. She understood why he'd brought her here, not as a gesture, as information, the particular kind of information that people share when they've decided someone has earned the right to it. It's good land, she said. All of it. Worth fighting for. Yes. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the valley with the expression she'd first noticed on the second day in the cabin, the expression she'd eventually identified as the look of a man discovering things about himself that surprised him. "You're going to have more visitors now," she said. "People are going to want to know the man who helped hold the mountain. Some of them are going to want things from you. Some of them are just going to want to say thank you." She paused. "You'll have to figure out how to let that happen. I know. You're not the same person who didn't open the door right away in that storm." "I opened the door." "Eventually," she said, "after I made an argument." Something crossed his face that was unquestionably a smile this time. Brief, crooked, the smile of a man who didn't use that face muscle set often enough to do it smoothly. It looked better for being imperfect. "You made a strong argument," he said. "I had good material." She turned back to the view. "Perseverance is a good mule." He laughed. She heard it as something she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. A real laugh, short and rough. The laugh of a person who hasn't done it in a while and is slightly surprised by the sensation. There are things you can say about what happened after, and things that resist being said because the truth of them isn't in the events, but in the spaces between. Holler filed the final paperwork in April, and the 9 claims were entered into the county record as fully compliant and legally unencumbered. The Blackstone Land Syndicate redirected its operations south toward a different county, which was not justice exactly, but was the practical result that mattered. Croft took 2 of his other cases with him and did not return. The Garza family broke ground on a second structure in May. The elder Whitmore brought his brother back from Colton, and they started running cattle on the eastern grazing land for the first time in 2 years. Pruitt found a productive seam in July and hired 2 men to help him work it, which brought 2 more families to the mountain, which brought the kind of gradual, slow accumulation of community that doesn't announce itself but simply becomes visible one day when you look around and realize there are more people here than there used to be. Mabel kept her post office counter hours Tuesday through Friday. She also rode up to the mountain regularly enough that Perseverance learned the trail without being guided, the mule navigating the turns by memory with the placid confidence of an animal that knows where it's going. Thomas Eddy stopped being surprised when she came in to look at the claim records. Ben Holler started keeping her a coffee cup on the shelf above his desk. The chair in the cabin, the second chair, the one with the repaired leg, became, over time, the chair she used. This happened so gradually that neither of them marked the moment it became a fact rather than a habit. That was how most of the real things happened. Not in declarations, but in the quiet accumulation of ordinary days, each one slightly different from the one before, building something that couldn't have been planned because it required all the accidents that had led to it. A washed-out road, a storm, a woman who knocked on the wrong door and refused to be turned away from it. Gideon came down from the mountain more often. Not comfortably, not easily, not as a man who had resolved his complicated relationship with people and towns and the ways of living that other people considered normal. He came down as himself, which was the only thing he'd ever been capable of, and probably the only thing worth being. Some people in Harlan's Crossing remained uneasy around him for a long time. Some of them came around. A few never did, and he made a kind of peace with that. Not the peace of someone who no longer minded, but the peace of someone who had decided it wasn't the thing that mattered most. What mattered was the mountain. What mattered was the people on it who had stood together when standing together was the only thing that worked. What mattered was a legal record that said this ground belonged to the people who had built their lives on it, and that record was not going anywhere. There is something worth saying about strength because Gideon Voss was a strong man, and that fact shaped every story anyone told about him. What none of those stories got right, and the people who told them could be forgiven because they were working from a distance, was what strength actually is and what it is not. Strength, as most people understand it, is about what you can withstand alone. It is the thing that lets you endure a winter by yourself and drive men off a mountain and go 11 years without needing anything you couldn't provide for yourself. That kind is real. Gideon had it in the way that some people have an unusual capacity for cold or pain, constitutionally, fundamentally, as a basic condition of how he was built. But there is a different kind that is harder to come by and harder to recognize, which is knowing what you cannot do alone and doing it anyway with other people, which requires the particular courage of making yourself visible to failure in front of witnesses. Every time Gideon knocked on a door on that mountain, every time he sat at a table in a lawyer's office and listened to someone explain a system he didn't understand, every time he said a thing he hadn't planned to say because someone was there and the moment asked for it, that was the kind that cost more. And Mabel, people in Harlan's Crossing would say for years afterward that she tamed him. They meant it as a compliment, but they had the thing backwards. She didn't tame anything. There was nothing in Gideon Voss that needed to be made smaller or more manageable or easier to live with. What she did was see what was already there and refuse to accept anyone's word over her own direct observation. She was not a woman who trusted other people's assessments. She trusted what she saw with her own eyes and what she learned with her own hands. What she had always known about herself, even when she was a child in a house where she was told repeatedly that she was too much, too large, too loud, too willing to fix things that weren't hers to fix, was that the too much was not a problem. It was a tool. The question was only what to use it on. She'd found a good answer to that question on a frozen mountain in a storm, knocking on a door because she was not ready to die and because she had learned, from a long time of being underestimated, that the only reasonable response to a closed door was to knock on it. In April, when the snow had pulled back enough to expose the south-facing bench above the cabin, Gideon began building something there. She found out about it from Hollis, who mentioned it in passing while collecting a parcel, saying Voss was up there working on what looked like a foundation. She rode up on a Saturday. He was on the bench with timber he'd hauled up himself, marking lines in the exposed ground. The view spread out below in all the clarity of early spring, the valley and the river and the long slopes of the mountain. She stood and looked at the lines he'd marked. Then she looked at him. "What are you building?" she said. He was looking at the lines too, with the expression she'd first seen when he looked around his cabin the night before they might have needed to flee it, the look of a man regarding something that mattered. "Something with 2 chairs," he said. She looked at the lines again. She looked at the view. She looked at him. She didn't say anything for a moment, because some things don't need to be said immediately, and the moment was clear enough without words. Then she said, "You'll want the main window facing south." "I know that," he said, "and the foundation will need to go deeper on the east side. The freeze line is lower there." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "You told me. Second day in the cabin, you were talking about where the ground thaws first in spring, and I was listening." He stood very still for a moment. Then he looked back at the lines he'd drawn, and she could see him revising them in his head, moving the east foundation mark down, and she knew from the way he did it, without ceremony, without making a thing of it, that he was the kind of man who changed his mind when he had reason to, which was one of the rarest things she knew about a person. "Help me find the east corner," he said. She walked over and they stood together on the bench in the April light, looking at the ground, and the mountain was what it had always been. Indifferent and enormous, and full of the kind of beauty that doesn't care whether you notice it. And below them, the valley held all the people who were still there and still standing on the land they'd chosen, which was not a small thing. It was not a perfect thing either. Nothing up here was. The legal record was clean, but the syndicate existed somewhere to the south and would find other ground and other people without enough neighbors. The mountain would send more storms. The Garza family would have a bad season eventually. Most families did. Gideon would have days when the town felt like too much, and he would come back up here and need the quiet the way some people need water. Mabel would knock on doors that didn't open and fix things that broke again, and carry medicine to people in storms that were worse than predicted. But this bench existed, this view, this foundation they were about to build together on ground that was legally theirs and morally theirs and practically theirs because they had stood on it and refused to leave. That was enough to build from. That was in the end what the mountain had always been waiting for someone to understand.